The Cold War wasn't just a battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, it was a global chess match, and some of its most intense moves played out in a place many wouldn't expect: the Caribbean. This region, known for its turquoise waters and tropical beaches, became one of the tensest fronts in the ideological war between communism and capitalism. From CIA-backed coups to full-scale US invasions, and even the brink of nuclear war, the Caribbean became a high-stakes battleground where superpowers fought for control, not just with weapons, but with political influence, economic sanctions, and covert operations. Cuba's revolution in 1959 changed everything. With Fidel Castro embracing communism and aligning with the Soviet Union, the Caribbean became a flashpoint for Cold War conflict. But Cuba was just the beginning. Over the next few decades, leftist revolutions, US interventions, and covert CIA missions would shape the region's future, leaving behind a legacy that still impacts these nations today. This is the story of how the Cold War played out in the Caribbean, and how a paradise became a battleground. Long before the Cold War turned the Caribbean into a battleground for superpowers, the region had already spent centuries under foreign control. The Caribbean story is one of conquest, colonization, and resistance. By the 19th century, European empires, Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, had carved up the islands, exploiting their land and people for profit. Sugar, tobacco, and coffee fueled the global economy. But it was the brutal labor of enslaved Africans and indentured workers that made it possible. In the 1840s, as the British Empire phased out slavery, they looked elsewhere for cheap labor. Shiploads of Indian indentured workers arrived in Trinidad, Guyana, and other parts of the Caribbean, signing contracts that promised a new life but often led to hardship and exploitation. These workers brought with them their language, culture, and traditions, forever changing the region's identity. But despite their contributions, they, like many others, remained under the control of colonial rulers. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, a new power emerged, one that would shape the Caribbean's future in ways few could predict. The United States, fresh from its victory in the Spanish-American War, declared the Caribbean its backyard. Under the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. positioned itself as the region's protector. But in reality, this often meant military interventions, economic dominance, and support for authoritarian rulers. From Cuba to Haiti to the Dominican Republic, U.S. troops invaded and occupied countries under the guise of maintaining stability, but often to protect American business interests. These interventions planted the seeds of resentment and resistance, setting the stage for future conflicts. But change was on the horizon. Across the Caribbean, the voices of the oppressed grew louder. From the workers in the fields to the students in the streets, nationalist movements began demanding an end to colonial rule, economic exploitation, and foreign interference. As the world edged closer to the Cold War, the Caribbean was already a region in turmoil, ready for revolution, and ripe for superpower influence. Before Cuba became the epicenter of Cold War tensions, it was a playground for the rich, a place where American businesses thrived, the mafia ran casinos, and a dictator named Fulgencio Batista ruled with an iron fist. Backed by the U.S., Batista's government protected foreign investments while silencing opposition with arrests, torture, and executions. But beneath the surface, discontent was growing. Enter Fidel Castro. A young lawyer-turned-rebel, Castro led a group of revolutionaries into the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, launching a guerrilla war against Batista's regime. With the support of the Cuban people and a charismatic ally named Che Guevara, Castro's movement gained momentum. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country, and the Cuban Revolution was victorious. At first, the United States saw Castro as just another nationalist leader. But when he began nationalizing American businesses, redistributing land, and aligning with the Soviet Union, Washington saw a threat. Almost overnight, Cuba went from being America's ally to its greatest enemy in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. wasted no time fighting back. In 1961, the CIA trained a group of Cuban exiles for a covert invasion, an attempt to overthrow Castro and restore U.S. control. But the Bay of Pigs operation was a disaster. The invaders were outgunned, outnumbered, and within 72 hours they were either dead or captured. The failed invasion only strengthened Castro's position and pushed him further into the Soviet Union's arms. What happened next brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. In 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Would the U.S. launch an invasion? Would the Soviets retaliate with nuclear strikes? In the end, diplomacy won. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, along with a secret deal to remove American missiles from Turkey. Despite the crisis, Cuba remained a key Soviet ally. The USSR poured economic and military aid into the island, turning Cuba into a communist stronghold in the Caribbean. But Castro didn't just keep communism within Cuba. He exported revolution across Latin America and Africa, training guerrilla fighters and supporting leftist movements worldwide. Cuba had transformed from a U.S.-backed dictatorship into a global symbol of communist resistance. But with the Cold War raging on, the Caribbean was far from done with conflict. Cuba wasn't the only island to feel the shockwaves of communism. As the Cold War raged on, leftist movements spread across the Caribbean, fueled by growing frustration with poverty, inequality, and foreign control. But every revolution had its consequences, and the United States was watching, ready to intervene at the first sign of a second Cuba. In 1979, the tiny island of Grenada made history. A charismatic socialist leader named Maurice Bishop led a bloodless coup, overthrowing the U.S.-backed government and declaring a people's revolution. Inspired by Fidel Castro, Bishop introduced free healthcare, education, and land reforms. He even formed close ties with Cuba, inviting advisors and engineers to help modernize the country. But to Washington, Grenada was another domino falling to communism. In 1983, tensions within Bishop's government led to his arrest and execution by hardline Marxists. Days later, using the instability as justification, the United States launched Operation Urgent Fury, an all-out invasion. Within weeks, the socialist experiment in Grenada was crushed, and a pro-U.S. government was installed. The Cold War had claimed another battleground. But Grenada wasn't the first time the U.S. sent troops to stop a leftist movement in the Caribbean. In 1965, a civil war erupted in the Dominican Republic as rebels tried to restore a democratically elected leader who had been overthrown by the military. The U.S. feared the rebels had communist ties, and within days, President Lyndon B. Johnson sent over 20,000 troops to restore order. What followed was one of the largest U.S. military interventions in Latin America. The rebels were crushed, and a pro-U.S. government was installed. Once again, Washington made it clear, communism would not be tolerated in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, in Jamaica, the Cold War wasn't fought with guns and invasions, it was fought with politics, propaganda, and music. In the 1970s, Prime Minister Michael Manley championed a socialist path for Jamaica. Inspired by Marcus Garvey's Pan-Africanist ideals, he introduced land reforms, free education, and closer ties with Cuba. He openly criticized U.S. policies, leading to economic pressure and fears that Jamaica might align with the Soviet bloc. The response? Destabilization. The CIA allegedly funneled money to Manley's political opponents, supported gang violence, and orchestrated economic sabotage to weaken his government. The 1980 election saw Manley defeated, marking another Cold War victory for the United States. But in the middle of all this political chaos, one voice rose above the violence: Bob Marley. His music carried messages of unity, rebellion, and resistance against oppression. Songs like Get Up, Stand Up, and War became anthems for those fighting against colonialism and injustice. Marley tried to bridge the political divide, even surviving an assassination attempt in 1976, believed by many to be linked to Cold War tensions. But despite the efforts of musicians and activists, the struggle between socialism and capitalism would continue to shape the Caribbean for years to come. The Cold War in the Caribbean wasn't just fought in the streets or on the battlefield, it was waged in the shadows. As leftist movements spread, the United States launched a series of covert operations designed to stop communism before it could take root. One of the most infamous of these was Operation Condor, a secret alliance between right-wing governments and U.S. intelligence agencies. While Condor primarily targeted South America, its methods, assassinations, kidnappings, and psychological warfare, found their way into the Caribbean, used against socialist leaders and activists deemed threats to American interests. But not all battles were fought with bullets. economic warfare became one of Washington's most powerful weapons. The U.S. imposed crippling sanctions and trade embargoes, most famously against Cuba. For decades, the embargo isolated the island, blocking food, medicine, and resources, all in an effort to squeeze Castro's government into submission. Yet despite the hardships, Cuba endured, relying on Soviet aid and its own resilience. While the U.S. was quick to overthrow leftist leaders, it had no problem backing brutal anti-communist dictators. In Haiti, the Duvalier, François Papa Doc, and later his son Jean-Claude Baby Doc, ruled with an iron fist, using death squads and terror to maintain control, all while receiving us support. In the Dominican Republic, Rafael Trujillo's reign was one of the bloodiest in the Caribbean. But because he was staunchly anti-communist, Washington looked the other way until his rule became too unstable to ignore. For decades, the Caribbean was caught in a deadly game between superpowers. To the U.S., stopping communism justified any means, whether through invasions, economic sabotage, or backing ruthless dictators. But as the Cold War drew to a close, the region would be left to deal with the scars of decades of conflict, intervention, and division. As the Cold War ended, its impact on the Caribbean didn't simply disappear. Nowhere was this felt more than in Cuba. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, so did the economic lifeline that had kept Cuba afloat. The country was plunged into what Castro called the special period, a time of severe shortages, blackouts, and food rationing. Yet, despite decades of U.S. embargoes and international isolation, Cuba adapted, embracing tourism and small-scale private enterprise to survive. The revolution endured, but at a cost. Grenada, once a battleground for Cold War tensions, took a different path. After the U.S. invasion in 1983, democracy was restored, but always under American influence. The country moved away from socialist policies, aligning itself with Western economic models. Though political stability returned, many questioned whether Grenada had truly been liberated or simply brought back under US control. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, former socialist-leaning governments pivoted to neoliberal reforms. In Jamaica, the socialist policies of the 1970s gave way to free market economics and heavy borrowing from the International Monetary Fund, moves that helped stabilize the economy but widened inequality. In the Dominican Republic, U.S.-backed leaders pushed privatization and foreign investment, steering the country away from past socialist experiments. Across the region, the Cold War's end didn't just bring peace, it brought economic and political shifts that still shape the Caribbean today. From Cuba's revolution to U.S. interventions in Grenada and the Dominican Republic, the Cold War transformed the Caribbean into a battleground of ideologies. Leftist movements rose and fell, governments were overthrown, and economies were reshaped under the weight of foreign influence. Even as the Cold War ended, its legacy remained, whether in Cuba's continued defiance, Jamaica's shift to free market policies, or the lasting scars of U.S. military interventions. Even today, the effects of Cold War interventions can still be felt across the Caribbean. Political divisions, economic struggles, and the ongoing presence of U.S. influence all trace back to this era of superpower conflict. The Cold War may be over, but its impact endures. But what do you think? What was the most significant Cold War event in the Caribbean? Was it Cuba's revolution, the U.S. invasions, or something else? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history